In this video, we're going to take a look at the create, delete, details, and edit pages that we created during the scaffolding process in the last class. So as you're going through this PowerPoint, I would like you to go to Visual Studio and open up the pages that you had created so far, okay, so that you can refer to it as we're going through each page. So we're going to begin with the index page model in Pages, Movies folder. When a request is made for the page, the onGetAsync method returns a list of the movies to the Razor page. So on the Razor page, the onGetAsync or onGet is called to initialize the state of the page, right? In this case, the onGetAsync gets a list of the movies and then displays them. So you're probably quite familiar with like most of the parts of the Razor page, but one thing that you might not be familiar with is the HTML helper DisplayName for. Okay, so you might notice DisplayName for HTML helper on your Razor page there. So what this does is it inspects the title property referenced in the Lambda expression here, right, to determine the display name. All right, so now we can move on to the create page model. So two things I wanted to talk about is the onGet method and then the bind property. Okay, so let's talk about the onGet method first. The onGet method initializes any state needed for the page, right? The create page doesn't have any state to initialize, so the page is returned. The page method creates a page result object that renders the create.cshtml, the Razor page. Okay, the movie property the movie property uses the bind property attribute to opt into the model binding. So when the create form posts the form values, the ASP.NET Core runtime binds the posted values to the movie model. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when the form is submitted on the create page model. So then we have the onPostAsync method, it's run when the page posts form data. So if there are any model errors, the form is redisplayed along with any form data posted. So most model errors can be caught on the client side before the form is even posted. So an example of model error is posting a value for the date field that can't be converted to a date. Okay, so but if there are no model errors, then the data is saved and the browser is redirected to the index page. So let's move on to the create Razor page. In the create Razor page, you'll notice the form method post, right? So the form method post element is the form tag helper. It automatically includes an anti-forgery token. The scaffolding engine creates the Razor markup for each field in the model. You would have observed that, except for the ID. Okay, the validation tag helpers that look like these. Okay, so go to your page and take a look at these two: ASP validation summary and ASP validation for. What they do is they display validation errors. The label tag helper, okay, looks like this. Okay, generates the label caption and the for attribute for title property. Okay, next let's look at the delete page. Deleting a row in the database is handled by the remove method. This takes a row object as the parameter, so we need to know which row to remove and somehow need to load that row. We can find the row using findAsync, which takes the row ID as a parameter and then returns a single row. The ID must be passed in the form postback, and this is triggered by a submit button you see in an A tag. So all the entity framework changes are only in memory until the save changes async method is called, which makes the changes to the database file. Then we have the update, or if you want to call it the edit page, page model. For the edit page, it displays most of all fields from the current record, most or all the fields from the current record, and allows the user to edit the fields in the input tags. Okay, the column names are placed in the label tags. The onGetAsync method accepts the ID as a parameter and makes sure that's not null. You will see, so open up your page, you'll see the first or default async method, which retrieves the matching record. It asynchronously returns the first element of a sequence that satisfied the specific condition, or if it can't find that, a default value. Okay, the record is then passed to a public member, which is referenced in the HTML markup. So since the record can be changed by the user, the bind property annotation is applied to the member so it can return to the server on form postback. Okay, so now let's take a look at the edit Razor page. You'll see that tag helpers are used as attributes of label and input tags. The ASP4 attribute needs the column name from the record schema so that it can bind the column name for the label or the record data for the input. Okay, the helper uses the data type from the Entity Framework model to determine which control type to display. Okay, so that brings us to the Entity Framework diagram here, just to show you how data is saved from the browser to the database. And we'll go through each one of these steps here. So first, the user makes changes to an existing data, adds new data, right? So over here. And then you go to the first step where the data is sent to the Razor page with a post method, which is usually triggered by a button click, okay, like a submit. Then the Razor page parses the data fields from the form post and assigns it to a member variable. And then in step 2, the variable is merged into the Entity Framework context database set using add for a new record or attach for an update or remove method for deletion. Then each of these 3 context methods generate the SQL statements necessary to complete the task. Okay, which finally brings us to step 3. The SQL is then sent to the database so the data can persist.